Thank you for attending today's lecture. I'm Rick Wilson, the Director of Ciencia, and I'd like to welcome all of you here. This year's series is on the topic of facts. It's a timely, exciting, and contentious topic. In the political realm, we've watched partisans bicker over what constitutes a fact, and oftentimes an alternative fact. In the scientific realm, we've seen a lot of conflict over which facts support conclusions about things like climate change. Ciencia's colloquium series this year looks at facts from multiple perspectives. And today we're particularly fortunate to have Neal speaking to us on the topic of, quote, giving science advice to the president is getting harder. Do facts really matter much, as you can see. Professor Lane earned his degrees from the University of Oklahoma. He began his career at the University of Houston in 1966 and came to Rice in 1969. In 1977, he became the chair of physics, space physics, and astronomy. And for a short interval, he served as the chancellor at the University of Colorado Springs. He quickly returned to Rice. Since that time, it seems like I've been working for Neal since the time he's been here. He was my provost at Rice from 1986 to 1993. In 1993, he became director of the National Science Foundation, where he was my boss again while I was program officer, and where I caused him multiple headaches over some of the research that I funded. From 1998 to 2001, Neal was the assistant to the president for science and technology, and upon returning to Rice, he became the Malcom Gillis University professor. And although I am director of Ciencia, Neal is a longtime Ciencia member and always provides me with wise counsel. So I still feel like I'm working for him. Nonetheless, Professor Lane has received the National Academy of Sciences Public Welfare Medal, the American Institute of Physics KT Compton Medal, the Association of Rice Alumni Gold Medal, and the Distinguished Friend of Science Award from the Southeastern University's Research Association. In 2013, he was given a special award. The National Science Board presented Neal with the Vannevar Bush Science Award, which recognizes exceptional service, lifelong commitment to science, and to the public welfare. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and many other honorary professional associations. So it's with his exceptional public service background that Professor Lane knows whereof he speaks. So I am particularly looking forward to today's lecture. Neal, it's my pleasure to introduce you.
Thank you very much, Rick. Good afternoon, everyone. Am I coming through all the way to the back? Thank you. I will try to speak up. Thank you, Rick, for that introduction, which shows that I fell off the scholarship wagon a long time ago. Or as my son once said in introducing me, my dad just can't seem to hold a job. Scientia, of course, is one of Rice's treasures. It's unique, in my experience at least, among universities across the country. And so I'm especially flattered to be asked to give a talk in this series. I'm anxious, given the quality of the talks before, and I've watched several of them again on the videos, which I very much appreciate, and have learned from the previous speakers. So I'm not at all confident I can add much to the discussion that we're having. But I sometimes say on these occasions that having worked in Washington where lack of substance seldom prevents anybody from talking, I will make a few remarks. I need to say at the outset, however, that if any of you have come expecting to hear a tirade of anti-president tweet rhetoric laced with rage and disgust, you've come to the right place. No, I won't. Strike that from the record. No, Scientia is a serious organization, and as you know, the previous speakers have behaved themselves, as I will certainly attempt to do. And besides that, I have family in the audience. So the title I chose for today's lecture, Advising Presidents Getting Harder, Do Facts Really Matter Much? It makes an assertion and it poses a question, and I'll try to talk a little bit about both. Of course, facts and truth matter when making policy, but they're not enough. They've got to be translated, they've got to be packaged, they've got to be effectively communicated in complicated networks in the federal government, in my case, and I'm going to talk about specific examples. And when you do that, you often muddle the facts and the truth, sometimes accidentally. I'll give you an example of that. It's very much been in my mind since Washington. And sometimes they're muddled on purpose. And that then allows bad players to use this misrepresentation, the complication of communicating facts and truth in policymaking, to be successful. Since my only experience is NSF and the White House, Office of Science, Technology, Policy, that's really where I will pick my examples. And as Rick Wilson said, it was a real pleasure to serve together. Well, not every day. It was a pleasure to serve together. We batted back some political flies. Rick could tell you stories about that one. I want to start with a Will Rogers quote, some wisdom from Oklahoma, Johnny, in my home state. So Will Rogers says, "It isn't what we don't know that gives us trouble, it's what we know that ain't so." Now, Will Rogers died in 1935, so this problem's been around a long time. In fact, if any of you are reading this latest book by Kurt Anderson, Fantasyland, he talks about 500 years of American history in which this has been a problem. People in large numbers in this country and in many other parts of the world believe things, deeply believe things, which have no basis in fact, no underlying evidence of truth. That opens our society up to the hucksters and the quacks and the crooks and even the megalomaniacs who lust, did I say lust? Who lust for power. The one thing that's very different from Will Rogers' time is the internet and the web. So now it really is possible to almost instantaneously spread wrong information across hundreds of thousands, millions of websites across the country and across the world. And often that bad information just gets amplified as it moves along. Vice President David Lebron in his talk noted that alt facts have been around for a long time in law and in science. Some things are wrong. Some things are really, really wrong. And so what matters is the degree of wrongness and the process whereby one works our way toward the truth. In this country at this time, the distinction, I would say, has gotten lost to a large segment of the population. Some political, corporate, community leaders, as well as unfriendly foreign governments, know how to take advantage of the mess. They're not only manipulating the facts, they're manipulating the process by which we try to gain proof from facts. So, with that, here's an outline of what I'd like to talk about. Science advice is a particular challenge. I don't mean it's more important. I just mean that's where I've had some experience, and there's some factors that I think make it a particular challenge when you're trying to advise the president or anybody else on what you ought to do that has something to do with science and technology. In this lecture, when I say science, I'm going to speak very broadly. I'm thinking science, engineering, technology, all the associated research and applications in government and outside, so I don't have to keep repeating. Engineering often gets lost in these discussions. It shouldn't, but they're so quick to say science and technology, people tend to forget that without engineering, you don't actually get the knowledge and discoveries through the scientific process into applications that are important to people. So that's what I mean by science. Society, but there are some things that I think taken together make science a particular challenge, and I want to talk a little bit about what those kind of things are. Then I'm going to talk about a few examples in the Clinton administration. The only way I can really try to illustrate some abstract points is to give you some examples. Some were good experiences, some were not great experiences, and I'll share a few of those with you. And then finally, the current dilemma, what to do. That's going to be really short because I have no idea what to do that's actually going to improve the situation. But one reason I'm here is that maybe you do, and I'm very anxious to hear about that. So first, science is a particular challenge. So I just pick out 4 factors. Cold War is long gone. That used to be a focus for science. It's not here now. Science is only one voice, so the challenge is make sure he gets heard in this process of advising and policy making. Serious policy work has lost favor, we'll all say. And then finally, the American people are uninformed. So I'll go through these one at a time very quickly. So first of all, science is long gone. So what I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is that before World War II, the federal government wasn't really much involved in science, and we on the campus didn't want them to be. We were doing our own thing with private money and university money. We didn't need the federal government involved. But in agriculture, money did start to flow. So the Morrill Act in 1862 and some legislation that followed set up the land-grant colleges and universities, the experimental research stations, the extension services to get this information out to the farmers who needed it to educate their kids. So universities, public universities, were established all across the country. It was an incredible contribution to American society and still is, even though we're pulling funding out of those organizations step by step as we speak. It was World War II where the federal government really very quickly ramped up its investment in research and development activities in universities and in industry. But now universities were quite happy to cooperate. Money flowed and everybody wanted to contribute to the winning the war, actually. We were scared, and rightly so. So that started a strong government-university partnership that after the Second War, at the end of the Second World War, continued, as Vannevar Bush, whose picture is up here, convinced President Truman at that stage that the right thing for the United States to do is continue to invest taxpayer money in research, in universities that's going to pay off in peacetime. Well, it wasn't peacetime. It was a Cold War, and that helped drive, though, I think, the continued investment. So during the early days of the Cold War, there was a focus on science, engineering, technology, but it was about bombs and rockets. It all had to do with problems we were having in the Cold War. I mean, think about it. When Eisenhower was president, so we had the first Soviet atom bomb explosion. We had the first hydrogen bomb explosion a couple years later. We had Sputnik, 2 satellites up while our rockets were falling over and blowing up. We had actually a package delivered on the moon by the Soviet Union in the latter part of that Eisenhower administration. And then, of course, we had Gagarin's orbiting flight. It was scary. It was scary, I'm sure, to President Eisenhower and everybody else. So there was an enormous increase in investment in defense R&D, non-defense R&D, the beginning of the space program, and after Kennedy's speech in 1961, speeches, one in the Congress, in 1962 here on the campus, we made these huge investments in the space program. It's a civilian program, but it was totally driven by fear of the Soviet Union. So as the Cold War wound down, we sort of lost focus on why we were doing science. Biomedical research grew all during this period. NIH budget grew by factors of 2, 3, 5. But in the last 15 years, it's been flattened down. There isn't any focus right now. There isn't any simple argument for the investment of funding taxpayer money in research. Now, you could say, well, it's good for everything. But in policy world, if it's good for everything, it doesn't stand out. And so it's not really clear now what it's good for. My talk's about science advice. So what were the science advisors doing during World War II? They were advising on the munitions and on defense technologies that were needed. Early Cold War, I've already said, mainly bombs and rockets and related kind of defense and offense weaponry. After the Cold War, it got more diffuse. So starting with George Herbert Walker Bush's administration, Bush 41, his science advisor, Alan Bromley, sort of reached out. The message started to be competitiveness, the fact that the United States is losing ground relative to Japan and other countries. We really need to beef up our investment And that did make a difference. It did help, and there was significant growth in investment in research during that period. But then that sort of got lost as well. So I would argue there really hasn't been a focus in recent years, and a lot of the recent science advisors have had to deal with that. I added at the last minute up here, maybe there is a focus. I mean, having a look at current administration, maybe it's Cold War II, with a huge increase, influx of money into the defense budget, much of which is, well, a huge increase into the defense budget. So now, second on my list, science is only one voice. So the president needs advice on many things. I say his or her priorities, because there's no reason presidents should be a he. We may have a president who is a she. What are these things? Urgent matters, crises, things you don't know often when you come in the morning are going to happen. Wars, disasters, pandemics, flu being a very bad one right now. Zika, Deepwater Horizon, and Fukushima, and things going on all over the world that have technical aspects, and the president, if it's a big deal, needs to know whether to do something, say something, or not. And the science advisor and his or her staff are responsible for that. Strategic issues. If the president has a vision for the future of America that has something to do with science and technology, then this office and the science advisor need to be a part of that. Congressional activities. Members of Congress are either out to get you or they're out to help you. Either way, you need to pay attention to what's going on. Campaign promises. Yeah, well, sure. Now, the president needs, I've already said, president needs facts, truth, and translation, but you have to keep in mind when you're advising a president, policy decisions are going to weigh factors other than science. Your job is to make sure the voice of science is heard. It makes its way into the Oval Office and whatever issue the president's thinking about. Few people in any White House know much about science. Political advisors don't bow to science, I can tell you for sure, and give you examples if you want them. But they're important. You need them. Political advisors tend to be closer to the president than anybody else. If you're trying to get a message to the president and the political advisors don't know where you're going or what's behind it, they can simply shut you down. The time is often short, stakes are high. I'll give an example of that. Evidence, facts, and truth must be understandable, and they need to be relevant. And there's no magic to how to make that decision. You just have to do it as best you can. The key to all of this is the president must be able to trust his advisors, and vice versa, I might add. If you've got a president who undercuts you all the time, that makes it very difficult to be an effective advisor as well. So then, serious policy work has lost favor. Okay, well, here's what we have right now in our federal government. So the president is the CEO of a very complicated government that is interwoven in difficult ways, and with lots of little silos around. Some connect a little bit, some don't. They have their own relationships with the committees in Congress, and so when the president thinks he's running it, the Congress thinks they're running it. So it's hard enough. He's got advisors. So he's got my office of Science Technology Policy, had 60 people. John Holdren, working with Obama, had 120. President Obama has about 40 right now. And so it varies through the years. National Security Council, OMB, they think they run everything. So the president's got plenty of advice if he takes advantage of it. He's got 15 cabinet secretaries. There are 15 statutory members of the cabinet. And then whoever he wants to add to the cabinet, they serve as advisors and they run these agencies. And then all these departments, all these agencies, some within larger departments and some. It's complicated, that's all I'm really saying with this slide. And it's embedded in all this yellow stuff. So it's hard enough to do anything with all of the people involved in our form of government. But then we got all this. Now we like some of these groups, lobbyists and so forth. Some of them we maybe don't like. In our society, the way our representational democracy works is we don't all have time to spend every day lobbying our congresswoman, our congressman, or senator, or president. So we go through organizations like this. They're very effective, but you can just imagine it's chaos. So we need rational debate and compromise, and I say good luck with that. American people are uninformed. So, and that's not an anti-American people part, because we can well ask, well, how would they be informed, and are we doing a good job at that? So please don't assume too much about that. Here are just a few examples. A lot of this is based on NSF data that they commission, but there are lots of organizations, you may know better than I, some of these. Plants produce oxygen, 60 to 70% people. Earth goes around the sun. Actually, that's 60 to 70% people. If you ask how long it takes, you lose 20% of the people. So I don't know, how long people think it takes for the Earth to get around the sun, but there is a problem. Angels and Satan, I took this off Rick's slide, so again, in this sort of 2/3 territory. Now, a lot of people sort of have, antibiotics don't kill viruses, Earth takes a year to go on the sun, I've already said. Can name a renewable energy source. Actually, only 40% of the people can name a renewable energy source. 60% can name a fossil energy source. Well, what about the other 40%? I mean, when they read things about renewable energy or fossil, if fossil, do they mean little fossils you crunch up and make energy out of it? People don't know. And so it's very difficult with that kind of knowledge base for people to make the decision. Astrology is scientific, well, sort of. I won't take a show of hands on any of this. Climate change. What do people know about climate change? Well, I put this up here because it's one of the examples of a huge Republican Democratic with a capital D gap. So global warming is happening. So you get 82%. Democrats, you get 50% Republicans. Of those who say it's happening, mostly due to human activity, 65%. Republicans, 31%. Most scientists think global warming is happening. So this is the most disturbing one. So if you ask people, what do scientists think? So here's what you get. Even among Democrats, you get, 64%. The answer is really 90% for all scientists, 97% for climate experts. So what's happening here? The doubt strategy is working. So the doubt strategy was written up quite well, I think, by David Michaels in 2008. Doubt is a product. And the doubt strategy is, don't go to the American people and say science is bad or science is wrong. Go to the American people and say scientists don't agree. Create doubt about what the scientific understanding is of anything. And it works. It's an old strategy. It's been around a long time. David talks about various memos that have been passed around by political consultants years ago. So the idea is you find yourself a so-called scientist, one or two or three, and get them out there saying, climate change is a hoax, more carbon is better, carbon is the breath of life, so that sort of thing that you've read. So a puppet scientist, and over time, not forever, but you can buy yourself time. You can buy an industry a long time. This strategy worked with the tobacco industry for a long time, actually, and then eventually it did. Acid rain, the same strategy was used. Ozone hole, climate change, and others. Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway wrote a book, Merchants of Doubt, in which they talk about particular scientists who are involved in this. Second on my outline, a few examples from the Clinton administration. Okay, so this is scars and bruise time. Okay, so I was happy in my provost office on this wonderful campus when I got a call probably in February where the secretary says, the White House on the line. I said, take a number. No, she said it's a real White House. So that's probably February. And then lots of stuff goes on. The February call would be, are you having any interest in being on this long list of people that we're considering as a possibility for the head of NSF? If not, we'll scratch your name off. It's really incredibly flattering kind of conversation. And I said, oh, why not? You'll leave me. I'm willing to stay on any list, a lot of reasons, whatever. So there are all kinds of papers back and forth and interviews and so forth. So whatever reason, probably the declination of large numbers of people are on that list. I went there in the summer of '93 with Johnny and her dog, Beagle the Beagle, right? Sorry. So I would call 1994 the year of getting to know the White House and Congress. So you run the halls, you meet all the chairs, People in your own building, of course. There were about a little under 2,000 people in the building. Learn what your job is, learn how to get between your house and the office and stuff like that. Then in the election of 1994, the Republicans took the majority in both houses. And therefore they came in January of 95 and whole new cast of characters. Of course, you knew these people. They were in the minority before, and you made nice because you need to do that. You never know what's going to happen. But the chairs all changed, the staff move out of their, the Democrats move out of the big offices into the small ones, and Republicans move into the big offices. It's a seismic change. It's incredible that we work that way in our system, but that's what happens. 95 is the year of Newt Gingrich, came with a mandate, contract for America. It's really contract on America. Cut government spending, get rid of agencies, and then in December, we had this month-long government shutdown. And finally, government opened, and then it snowed and shut down the city. And then the following Monday was Martin Luther King Day. So we really couldn't get back to work. During that period, a few of us were allowed to work. The non-essential people actually kept in the building. And so those of us there, we'd answer the phone, hello, National Science Foundation, nobody's here, please hold. So it was a very difficult period. And of course, we tried to stay, my deputy and I tried to stay in touch with our employees as best we could, because people weren't getting paid. They didn't know when they'd go to work again. Those that were required to come to work, and some were not assured they would ever be paid for the time. It was crazy, terrible period. And then we had a few years of relative sanity, I would call. During my NSF time, I just used two examples. Sometimes you need to advise everybody. I had a hassle with OMB. They wanted to, in a computer exercise, they wanted to cut our budget by 10%. I knew it was never going to happen, but you just don't want anything like that happening in the government. Somebody might forget, throw the switch, and suddenly you lose money. So I went over to the vice president, who of course was a strong advocate for what we were doing. Didn't have to convince him NSF was important. So I used the efficiency argument that he could then use inside the White House and to explain to OMB why they should not cut us 10%. I said we were the most efficient agency in the federal government. I don't know if that was true. But my staff put together the data that I could show the vice president to convince him it was true. Think about the National Science Foundation. It doesn't run anything. So it has a relatively small number of employees for a relatively large budget. So numerator denominator argument. Then I went over to the National Science Board. You'll see Richard Tapia back there, who is on the board. I don't know how that halo appeared. I'm sure I didn't put it in there, but it just popped up. I don't know if Richard is a saint or not, but this is some kind of evidence, I think. There we went to Gingrich, and this is his Gingrich when he was speaker. This was his conference room. And Richard will remember, if you look back over Gingrich's shoulder, it's a giant glass case with a T-Rex skull in it. So when you're sitting here like I was, looking at Gingrich, right over his shoulder are these huge teeth coming down, and so it's distracting and so forth. Gingrich was a techie. We got hurt in the budget process, not as badly as some other agencies. And I was told by our appropriation chair, Jerry Lewis in California, that had Gingrich not intervened, NSF would have lost a lot more money than it did. Okay, I'm done saying nice things about Newt Gingrich. Here are two issues that were large enough at NSF that the president would need to know. I never briefed the president personally on either one of these, so I don't want you to think otherwise. When you're head of an independent agency, your interaction with the president is largely through the president's science advisor or sometimes the vice president. I gave you an example. So LIGO, some of you may know about LIGO, Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory. It rolls right off the tongue. It was a project that NSF was funding before I even got there to build two detectors that would look for gravitational waves that would help show that Einstein knew what he was doing with his theory of general relativity. And you'll know recently, last couple of years, finally, gravitational waves were directly observed. They were known to exist through indirect measurements, and Nobel Prizes were given earlier. Nobel Prize was given earlier for indirect observation, but this was the first direct observation of gravitational waves. What are they? They're two laser beams. They're about 2 miles long each. They're perpendicular roughly. And the idea is you've got lasers in there, and if they're perfectly aligned, they'll perfectly interfere. So when a wave comes through, tiny, tiny ripple in space, it's a quadrupole wave, so it'll push space out this way, and in this way, and out this way, and in this way. And so one of these arms will stretch a little bit. The mirror on the end will stretch a little bit. The other one will come in a little bit. It's just enough to put these light beams out of sync, and you'll measure that. You can measure what we said, it's true, right? We just said it. You can measure the movement of that mirror 1/10,000th of the diameter of a proton. Now, when I heard that, I thought, this is a big deal. This is real technology. So what was the problem? Management problems in the project. These things had not been built when I got to NSF. NSF had started funding the development of these facilities and would have continued, but the project had gotten in management difficulties, over budget and under schedule. And the management just wasn't doing what the university, Caltech, and MIT had promised. So NSF had pulled the money. It pulled the plug on the project. It was not going to go forward if something didn't happen. So I liked the project. Fundamental, only chance to do it given the climate that we were working in politically. Got to find a way to get it back. So I called the president of Caltech and I said, if you can straighten out the management, then I'll take it back to the National Science Board and to OMB and to the president, and if he approves, on to the Congress, and we'll get it started again. So to his credit, Tom Everhart was president in those days, working with MIT. He changed it. He found somebody and hired him who knew how to build facilities, high-energy physicist named Barry Barish, one of the individuals who shared the Nobel Prize in physics for the observation of gravitational waves. And so we started it up again, and all we really said is, it will open a new window in the universe. Boy, it's a pretty strong statement, and we didn't see gravitational waves for decades, but of course I was long gone by then, so what did it matter? From a point of view of federal government policy. But it's all very exciting what was observed. So black hole collisions, and then the more recent one was collision between neutron stars, in which we learned a lot about neutron stars because we had simultaneous optical observations at the same time as we had the gravitational waves arrive, or the same time frame from the same events. Anyway, so I felt good about that. South Pole. Well, NSF runs the U.S., everything the U.S. does at South Pole and the Antarctic. It has a responsibility for the U.S. presence in the Antarctic. It came out of the treaty following the International Geophysical Year. So it's more than funding research. It's also environmental policing and all the logistics and so forth. So it is actually true that NSF runs something. They run these facilities. Now, the building you see in the foreground was not there when I was at NSF. That dome back there that's half covered with snow was where people were living at the South Pole. Now, I made 4 trips there. The first one, I thought, this is horrible. This is unbelievably primitive. And the people who work there in the summer, when the temperature runs up, kind of balmy -25 Fahrenheit, they live in tents with outdoor facilities. And so not only did I think it was uncomfortable, I thought it was inefficient and not so productive. But people are there in the winter also. In the winter, the temperature's like -80, -90 Fahrenheit. And if you need to get out of the dome, fire or something, you're dead. I mean, you don't go out and build an igloo at -80. So I thought one could make an argument, which I believed, that it was unproductive and it was dangerous. Now, I never said the word dangerous because you can't be running a dangerous facility, but I said words that kind of worked around that. So I took the project to, first of all, we put together a plan to rebuild it. It's going to cost, I don't know, $120 million, something like that. I then first asked the White House, is this still the policy that the National Science Foundation has this geopolitical responsibility to maintain the U.S. presence, including year-round presence at South Pole? So they stirred around and reviewed all of the the treaty and the rest of it, came back and said yes. So I said, okay, how about we rebuild the South Pole Station? And so here's the proposal. And then I found a guy named Norm Augustine. I called him up. He was CEO of Lockheed Martin at that time. He was a Republican and very good step with both parties. And I asked him whether he would chair a review committee, one of these blue ribbon committees, because I knew we were going to need cover on the Hill and so forth. I thought he could help us. He claims that I called him on the phone and said, Norm, how would you like to go south for the holidays? and when he got to my office, I had a map of the Antarctica. Now, he's a good storyteller. I'm sure I told him on the phone what I wanted him to do. I knew he'd been to the Antarctic on a cruise, but there's no way he could have gotten to the South Pole. And he's really an adventurer. He likes to see everything in the world. He took on this task. We pushed it all through the system. The money got appropriated and the thing got built. And then he and I were invited down in 2008, I think, to see the finished facility. It's built on stilts so the snow doesn't blow over it. And it has all kinds of fire control and so forth. So I'm hoping it's a wonderful facility. And I believe that it is. So White House. So either the president liked what I was doing or he didn't, but he moved me to the White House in '98 to replace his science advisor, Jack Gibbons, who'd done a wonderful job through all the first term and part of the second. In December of that year, the House impeached President Clinton. It was my fault. But you can imagine it was a very difficult time for the country and a very difficult time inside. So you write your new guy on the block, your new person on the block, and you come in, you're going to try to find your way and so forth, while the Senate is considering whether to throw the president out of office or not. So I was very careful in those days not to do things that I was willing to do later, not to take chances that I was willing to take following that. I went to my first State of the Union address when the Senate was getting ready to take up the trial, whether to throw the president out of office or not. It was not a fun time. Senator quits the president. People stood behind the president, or enough people did. And then we got some things done in nanotechnology, human genome, space station, and so forth. Then, of course, President, we got a good budget, of course, in 2001. That's when the deficits were turning into surpluses, and the president and the Congress were going to spend money. So its timing is everything. George Bush then assumed the presidency, and I went home just the day before Inauguration Day, as the Texans were coming in. They'd had a little bit to drink on the plane and coming in with the cowboy hats and so forth. I knew I was going the right direction. So I had really good bosses, and they understood science. They were just terrific, easy to advise people like Gore and Clinton. Well, Gore sure was strongly focused on IT and climate change, and he was a good mentor of Clinton with regard to climate change, I would say. I like this picture because my lovely wife of 58 years is standing there saying nice things about me to the president. So my message here is if you want to communicate to the president, you need to be close to the Oval Office, but you don't want to be too close to the Oval Office. So the separation between my parking place and the president's parking place is about right. OSTP did not occupy the entire Dwight David office, Eisenhower Executive Office building, but that's where our offices were. And so I could get between my office and the Oval Office, or the Roosevelt Room, or the Cabinet Room, whatever, in about 4 minutes or so. And so you're inside the security fence, and that's about right. You don't want to be in the West Wing. You don't want to be there during impeachment time. You don't want to be there when the lawyers and the political advisors are swarming around trying to figure out what to do for the president. You don't want to be there with Nixon when Watergate time. His science advisor commented about that was a good time to be outside the White House. That's what I mean by not being too close. You don't want to get tangled into the political process. You want just an arm's length relationship, but you need to be relevant. So close but not too close. Well, here's one way to get close but not too close. So every morning there's a staff meeting, chaired by the chief of staff, in my case John Podesta. I point to Jack Lew, who was OMB director then, but later became Secretary of Treasury under Obama. And my spy back there in the back, who knew all these political people but worked for me and could keep an eye on it, keep my eye on my back, if you like. I mean, things I need to know that for some reason I did not know. So he would be very helpful that way. You got free coffee if you get there early enough. My chair, I took the picture. The alien scientist is a whole other story, but it's an example of being a team player. When we were doing a skit that was making fun of Gene Sperling, it wasn't wise because he was a very influential White House person, but the press secretary put me up to it, so I wore that outfit and read a script. And so it was part of being a team player, but you're going to pay a price for it downstream. So here's some things that went on, some policy issues that went on while I was there, on which I had to advise the president. So research funding, that's the budget process. And so you're always making the case. Of course, knowledge is important to our society and the advancement of civilization and so forth. Politicians really don't care much about that. The president does. The president did, but lots of policy people don't. What they care about is the front end of technological innovation, jobs, companies, and so forth, and good things for society. And of course, protection of the environment and health and all the other things that flow. So those are the arguments you make. The National Nanotechnology Initiative, we presented to Clinton, he liked it, and I'll say a word about it. Climate change, we published the first assessment of the potential impact on the United States of climate change. That didn't go so well, I'll tell you about that. And then Kyoto was signed before I got to the White House, but there are follow-on activities. And we tried to fund human embryonic stem cell research. Congress blocked that for us anyway. George W. Bush did approve a limited research on embryonic stem cell research lines. Ballistic missile defense, that was a classified project, but my job was to make recommendations to the president. Answering the question, is this system work? Well, of course not. Okay, so cybersecurity. I worked with the National Security Council to try to get a slightly arm's length from government operation going with the private sector to start to educate banks and other vulnerable entities on the dangers coming from cyber. We couldn't do it. Congress did not understand, or we were not good in selling it. GPS resolution, well, it was 100 yards before. We worked with the intelligence agencies to get it down by an order of magnitude. So I feel really good about that. None of these things are things Neal did. I mean, these are things where you're there and you participate, you play a role as a member of a team, but for the most part, other people are in the lead on all these matters. NNI. So this is the National Nanotechnology Initiative. I learned about nanotechnology from Rick and Bob, of course, and then when I got the National Science Foundation, I had a better understanding that other people had paid attention, and it was an active field all across the country and the world. In the private sector and companies, of course, as well as universities. And I had a guy named Mike Rocco, who was on the engineering staff there, who not only was supporting this kind of work through the National Science Foundation, he was collecting other agencies together around the table to discuss what everybody was doing in this area and how they might do it better together. And he was working with Tom Khalil, who was already in the White House, in the National Economic Council, who was very interested in this technology. So when I got over there, this table was really already set. There were a lot of good people developing ideas for a possible initiative, and so all I did, once somebody told me I could, was elevate the whole process to the president. Just say, all I had to do was say, President Clinton is interested in nanotechnology. And so suddenly you bring the level of the committee activities up to the president's level, and they wrote a report and they wrote a proposal. The government wrote a proposal for an initiative, presidential initiative, funneling more money into nanoscale science and engineering. I had told the Congress, it was just an afterthought when I left NSF, my last hearing, I was asked one of the softball questions, like, well, Dr. Lane, what do you see in the future of science? Great discoveries. And of course the answer to that should be Stephen Hawking's answer. I have no idea. We don't know what's going to happen, but I was not as smart as Stephen Hawking. So I said, if you're asking where the next breakthroughs might really occur, I would vote for nanoscale research. And of course, nobody in the committee, Congress knew what a nanoscale was, and it didn't matter. It was just a response. We put together the proposal. I wanted the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology to support it, to the president, because they also advise the president. They're external people. Then I co-chair that group. Chuck Vest, who was on that group, was sadly died a number of years ago. He was then president of MIT. He liked this project, and he chaired a little working group, and he brought in Rick to work with that little group. Anyway, we recommended it to the president. He liked it. He called it my tiny little initiative. And I said, yes, Mr. President, it's going to cost $500 million. So he said, okay. So he put it in his budget. And then when President George W. Bush received a bill passed by Congress to authorize the initiative, he signed that bill into law. And President since then, I don't know about current president, but certainly President Obama liked it as well. President Clinton announced this initiative in a talk he gave at Caltech. And so we flew out Air Force One. It's a nice plane. I mean, it's old, but I recommend it as a place to travel. Usually you have a briefing or so beforehand, so that's John Podesta, who was Chief of Staff, and then one of the President's speechwriters. He was about 18 years old. Anyway, very talented guy, and I enjoyed working with him, even though we didn't have a full agreement on this speech. So anyway, we went out. I took a picture next to the plane, and somebody came running out. Apparently it's against federal law to stand by the airplane and get your picture taken. But I do have the picture. On Air Force One, President Clinton came to me and said, Neal, how do you like the speech? Well, it's a great speech, Mr. President. Of course, because my staff helped write it with speech writers. And so then he said, is there anything I ought to say that's not in here? And I said, I'd been working with a speechwriter for weeks trying to get a phrase in the speech that the speechwriter kept taking out. And it wasn't in there. I knew it wasn't in there. But the president asked. So I said, well, now that you asked, Mr. President, I think you'd like to say the following. And I forgot exactly how I put it. He said, yeah, that's a good idea. Where would I put it? I said, you can put it in page 4, paragraph 3. So here's what he said. Just as an aside, I'd like to say, because we're here at Caltech, Einstein's contributions remind us how greatly American science and technology, and therefore American society, have benefited, continue to benefit from the extraordinary gifts of scientists and engineers who were born in other countries. And we should continue to welcome them to our shores. And he got a big applause. Thank you. He was very happy about it, actually. After we left government, Johnny and I were in China, and the Chinese Academy of Sciences, whenever they can, they set up a meeting with President Jiang Zemin, who's a techie. And so we had an hour with him, and he wanted to talk about string theory and all kinds of things. I did the best I could. But he said, he and Clinton had talked about nanotechnology at the recent economic summit. And I wondered what the president of France might have thought about that conversation. But then next day this appeared, and my sweet wife said, slow news day. Climate change, well, the Earth is warming. One thing I want to make by this slide is I went to the NASA website to see what was there, and it's quite good. All the climate information is still up on the website. It was this morning or yesterday when I looked. So all this stuff has not disappeared from all the federal websites. We shall see. You keep an eye on it. It's on my watch list. But it's there, and a lot of other interesting information. Gore, of course, passionate about it, but he got that way from scientists, and he would ask me to bring in scientists to sit and talk with him about a book they'd written or an article or so forth. A very interesting conversation. Then I mentioned we published a report required by law, required by the act that President George Herbert Walker Bush signed in 1990, the U.S. Global Change Research Act, requires us to publish this report on the possible impact of climate change on the U.S. So we followed the law, and no good deed goes unpunished. So we got sued by Inhofe, senator from my home state, Oklahoma, who wrote this book, The Greatest Hoax, and by the Heartland Institute, another sort of anti-climate. So we've named in this suit. We published it anyway. The courts did not prevent us from publishing the report. And then when President Bush came in, the suit was sitting there. So he was being sued by presumably some people who were supporters of him. It got settled very quietly. Human Genome Project. Well, I'll tell you more than I know about the Human Genome. So, Human Genome is the stretch of DNA, double-stranded DNA that wraps around all of our 23 chromosome pairs. It contains all the information, the blueprint people talk about of human life, and you find it in our cells. And so the project started in 1990, 15-year project, $3 billion. Federal government can partner with the UK and other governments to sequence all the base pairs, line them all up, find out what the ordering is, and how many genes there are, and what kind of genes there are. Now, it isn't as simple as this diagram. What I read more recently is nobody even knows what a gene is anymore. It's much more complicated than we thought before, in part because of this project. So that was what we were really supposed to do. And we made clear in the beginning that the raw sequence data from this project can be publicly available to anybody to use for any purpose you want to. That was the ground rule. So when I got to the White House, Craig Venter had started a small company called Celera Genomics. And Craig, who was is a brilliant man and had been involved in the Genome Project before, he was off on his own. He'd gotten money from Perkin-Elmer Company to start Celera Genomics by sequencing machines, and then he goes to the press and says, the federal government is wasting taxpayer money. I'm going to be able, on my own, to sequence the genome faster, cheaper, better, 10 cents on the dollar. Don't pay any attention to those folks. I'll do it. Anyway, it got bad. You can imagine $3 billion worth of wasted taxpayer money, so there were lots of back and forth, cat calling, and not just between Francis Collins, who was the project director of the international project, and Craig Venter, a lot of others. So Clinton didn't like what was going on. So he said, Neal, need to fix it. Right, I mean, so the answer to that is yes, Mr. President. And then you go away and drink wine, do whatever you can. So one of the worries was that Celera was going to wrap up the whole genome in patents and make money off of it. If they weren't going to make money, why was Perkin-Elmer funding them? Now, Craig said he was not going to do that. On the other hand, people were suspicious. The UK was on our backs because they had a lot of money invested. And Clinton wanted to know, what are we patenting anyway? So I wrote him a memo saying this is our policy on patenting genes. And there's no need to read all this, but I put it up here so you can see how presidents communicate with science advisors. So Clinton says, a separate question, which apparently I wasn't smart enough to answer, is whether the patent office has the capacity to make A, the right calls, and B, in a timely way. Does it, he said. When he adds does it, it means he really would like to know. And so I wrote him back. I don't remember what I wrote him back, but it was probably something along the lines of they do the best they can, but frankly, Mr. President, really not. It was a very complicated business. As you know, genes are not patentable anymore after a Supreme Court decision. So we were prescient in a way, worrying about this, but it didn't help me in the time. So that's how the president communicates. Because the secretaries know I can't read his writing, and they're worried. They always put, when they give me the memo, they give me feedback, they give me translation down at the bottom. He couldn't read my writing either. So started out okay. So first Neal's fix it, is to reassure the partners in the UK and other countries and in the US, understand that the rules didn't change. We stand by our original agreement that the entire sequence, raw data, will be not protected by patent. So if they're publicly available for anybody for anything you want to use. And we crafted a statement, it was vetted all around by all the appropriate agencies in the White House and so forth. And then the president announced the statement with Tony Blair coming in on the video at one of the award ceremonies, Medal of Science, Medal of Technology award ceremony, which Richard knows about, having been an honoree. But the rest of the day didn't go so well. We started to see headlines online. Clinton Blair to stop gene patents. Clinton Blair Human Genome Initiative causes gene stocks to plummet. And I take an excerpt from a book written about all of this by James Shreve. In announcing the news briefing, Joe Lockhart press secretary, says that the President and Prime Minister are advocating a ban on intellectual property protection for any genetic discovery. So I was called down quickly to the press briefing to explain what was going on, along with Francis Collins. And nobody had told me the stock had crashed and so forth. First I knew, some reporter said, Dr. Lane, did you know that the biotech market is off 20%, whatever the number was? And I said, I didn't know that, and I know it has absolutely nothing to do with this statement, which was what I thought might be true at the time, not knowing to the contrary. Here's the way James Shreve describes me. Lane stood rigidly squinting against the glare of the television light. I don't squint, I just don't open my eyes very much. A mild-mannered physicist who had risen to the summits of public science administration. He looked as if he would be glad to be right back in the comparative safety. Anybody thinks the university lecture hall is a safe place to be hasn't taught in the university. So I apparently said, I don't remember. I want to make it absolutely clear the statement has nothing to do with an ongoing discussion between private and public sector. But then I went on to say, apparently, I also want to make it clear the statement is not about patents and what should or should not be patentable. Of course, that's wrong. It's exactly what it's about. It's about not patenting the entire human genome. I guess I said that, but I haven't checked the White House records to be sure. So that didn't go so well, right? I got a phone call from Craig. Solera had lost $2 billion. I said, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Well, I don't know, put yourself in the position, what are you going to say? Yeah, I got calls from other places. In fact, I was briefing the president on something else shortly after this all happened, and I told the president, it looks like we crashed the biotech market, and the NASDAQ actually fell right after it. He said, oh, he seemed to appreciate being the information. Next day, he was giving a speech someplace, and he said, well, yesterday we crashed the market. We really didn't mean to. So the market's recovered. So, yeah, people lost money and then they gained money, but it wasn't long before the whole tech balloon collapsed. Whether we were responsible, I don't know. Second part of the fix-it, the first part having worked so well. I said, well, Mr. President, look, okay. Okay, so we've had that little problem, but now what we can really do is you can hold an event in the East Room, and you can invite Craig and Francis Collins. They were about ready to announce the first draft of the Human Genome, sort of 90% or so of the sequencing. Pretty imperfect, but you could announce it any day. Why don't we celebrate the announcement that the first draft has been sequenced and be released, and it'll come out in the usual papers in Science and Nature. And they'll say, you say nice things about them, they'll say nice things about one another and so forth, and peace will break out. They agreed to do it. The event went fine. So that part was good. And the reason it went fine was not a Neal thing. It was this guy, Ari Petrinas, who worked for the Department of Energy. He ran their part of the genome program. He knew both of these guys personally. So he invited them secretly to his basement for pizza and beer. First meeting didn't go well. But over a couple of meetings, they finally agreed to do this. Otherwise, it would not have happened. So everybody happy now? Well, it's better press anyway. And then later, of course, Time Magazine put them on the front of the magazine. There's a whole story about how that might not have gone well. Anyway, those are just two examples about communication and what can go wrong, and then what sometimes works. And that's why I wanted to use them. So here are just some takeaways about my experiences as science advisor. It's not personal. None of this is about Neal. People are yelling at you or people are complimenting you, whatever. It's about your role and the importance of whatever job you are doing. Facts and truth matter, but you need translation. And we talked about the team effort and the importance of trust. There'll be surprises. You'll be tested. You got to know when and how to stand firm. You got to step over the line occasionally, or you don't know where it is. So that's the assertive part. It really is a team effort, but if you're not sufficiently assertive, you can't get your ideas through. So, current dilemma, what to do. I said this is be quick, but I'm going to use this Dickens slide since we're not all that far past the holidays, and it's the world we're thinking about in the U.S. So this is what the Ghost of Christmas Present had to say to Scrooge. And I suggest you find Bob Patton if you want to know the details behind this. He's an expert. This boy is ignorance and this girl is want. Beware them both and all of their degree. But most of all, beware this boy. For on his brow I see is written, which is doom, unless the writing be erased. Well, we have want in our country and we have ignorance. And we have want and ignorance across the world, and people are looking for leadership. And so here's our answer to that. What could I say about that? Well, I turned to Thumper. I mean, Thumper's mom knew what to say. Here's the cabinet. I won't take time to do this because we're over. You know some of these people. You follow what they're doing. I've never seen anything quite like it. Many of them have to do with science and technology, and many of those agencies support research and development. So there's reason to worry. You've got the Tea Party guy running the OMB and dismantling the Financial Protection Bureau, whatever it's called, Consumer Protection Bureau, Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, and other things going on. And rather than try to list things that are happening, the list is just too long to worry about. I just put out something I call a watch list. Not on here, of course, is the Paris Agreement, which we're pulling out of or not, depending on which day, or the nuclear agreement with Iran, extremely important, which we are going to pull out of or not, I mean, depending. So there's some really big issues, but there are all kinds of things going on, having to do with open positions, having to do with conflicts of interest, so forth. I just call it a watch list, not concluding for you because you know how these things are. What to do? George Brown, former congressman of California, District of California, and chairman of the House Science Committee for many, many years, died a number of years ago. But he told us 40 years ago that you scientists really need to become more involved with the political process and the needs of the broader society. You need to be more effective citizens. His speechwriter in those days then became my speechwriter in NSF, and she coined the term civic scientists, and we've been talking about it ever since. And my point here, without reading these things, is there are thousands of civic scientists, engineers, technical professionals who've gotten out of their laboratories, who are out into the public, in the policy community, or just out in the general public, the school and the communities and the churches and so forth, trying to say why science technology is important, answer questions, have a dialogue with the American people, which is what we need. We had the Science March, April 22nd. I'll steal the David Lebron's opening line where I'll say, this is the largest gathering in the mall that has ever been assembled. It may be the largest gathering anywhere in the world anyway. It was a wonderful event. I was worried about it. It turned out to be a picnic. People brought their kids. This is my favorite slide from it. We're going to hear from this young man, I can tell you. So it's a wonderful headline here. So we got all these people running for Congress. These are scientists or engineers are running in large numbers for Congress, for legislatures, school boards, and so forth. They're being encouraged by 314 Action, which focuses not just on getting scientists into public office, but other things. I showed you this yellow slide before, and I'm saying we're missing signal in the noise, not getting our message through. We have lots of societies. We're members of various of these science, engineering societies, and they do important things, and they should keep doing it, but they're not doing them together. The whole can be much greater than the parts. We need a common message, and we need a certain amount of coordination. The Baker Institute is doing what we can in the Civic Scientist program, bringing speakers in, writing reports, cooperating with other agencies. So this is my end. So the future. Why are my grandkids smiling? Well, because Johnny and I are their grandparents, of course. Because there really is reason to be optimistic, I think, and it's you and it's your students. I mean, when I meet with students on this campus, and last week I was on Texas A&M campus, meeting with students who are interested in policy, I come away feeling much more optimistic about the future. We've left them a mess, but we've also left them a lot of knowledge that didn't exist when we were young. Technology didn't exist when we were young. And they know a lot about the world, and they're interested in trying to solve some of these problems. Could be what Churchill said. You can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they exhaust. Let me give you one more. This last couple slides have nothing to do with the talk, but a crisis erupted in Chief of Staff's meeting. Betty Curry came in and found me. She was President Clinton's private secretary, and she came up to me and she said, "Neal, Socks is lonely." Oh, man. What are you going to say? Socks was Chelsea's cat. Chelsea was off to Stanford. Socks had a room with Buddy, President's dog. Socks didn't like Buddy. And she said, Socks needs to be with a family who really like cats and dogs. She knew we brought our grandkids in to see Socks and Buddy sometimes. She said, "How would you like to take Socks home for the weekend?" And I said, "I'm not going to put up with the Secret Service." She said, "No." Just, cat doesn't get Secret Service protection. And I said, "Well, let me talk to Johnny." And we talked about it, and we thought, well, why not? You know, the photographs, it's a story. Then I thought, what if the cat gets out? How do you go to your neighbors and say, have you seen a cat that looks a lot like the president's cat? It was fine. The problem was that when our beagle Bagel met the cat, not realizing the cat didn't like Buddy, the cat went, you know, and so Bagel then had to spend the weekend in the basement, and so that was the only downside of it. My mother lost her breakfast pudding, but that's okay. She was Democrat. First cat ate her pudding. That's all right. My grandkids. This is a 10-year-old slide. So my grandson Alex is you know, a handsome university computer guy, and my granddaughter, a very successful businesswoman in the Houston community. And so after we got the cat back in safe quarters, a few days later we got a letter from the president. "Dear Neal and Johnny, your recent service not gone unnoticed." Happy New Year to you both. Sorry about running over. Thank you very much.
I believe we have a couple minutes for a couple of questions, if anyone has them. Otherwise, I'm shocked you have one.
So Neal, you know, I see this part of the split so strong that I don't see people coming forward like Norm Augustine and things like that. Okay, are they around? Are they there? Will they continue to lead? Even though, you know, I love Norm, and yet, you know, he's a Republican.
So I'm not sure I understood your question.
But I mean, okay, is the split so strong that we won't see people coming forward that are represent the middle and all? That's it.
Well, there's no, of course, I don't have the answer to that. We have all our views about how we got spread so far apart. David Brooks wrote a column, maybe this morning, I can't remember, this morning or yesterday morning, addressing this issue from his perspective. But it was more in the abstract of this organization called Better Angels. You know about Better Angels? So they go around the country and they try to bring opposing sides together, and they have a strategy about how to do that. I think it's almost like Art Petrinas bringing Francis Collins and Craig Venter together. You sort of have to start with some kind of common ground. I mean, can we find something to talk about that doesn't start here, but rather starts here? And what it's really doing is putting a human face on the discussion, and that's what we're missing. I think most of us know conservatives. Maybe we have conservatives in the room, so you may know them because they're sitting next to you. I don't know many Trump voters, but they're there. When you meet them, they're not so different. They're nice people. I mean, you might say, well, they're misinformed or whatever, but on the human side, I mean, my mother sadly died a number of years ago. She had not much good to say about Republicans, but she never met a person she didn't like, Republican or Democrat. It's the human side that we're missing. And if we can find a way, and the only way I know to do it is through leadership at various places, in the state level and, of course, in Washington, we don't currently have that. We don't have any leaders I know of who are looking for a way to talk about unifying the country. What we have is leaders who are trying to take advantage of that split and just split it wider because it's to their advantage to do so.
Exactly. I agree with you about the young people. I think they can very good.
Thank you for the question.
So,
Girl has
I'm going to speak the old the dead in a minute. There's a question of who is a real certifiable expert. And the problem is it's tricky. We had a guy named Frederick Seitz, who was at the National Medal of Science, was president of the National Academy of Sciences, was president of Rockefeller University. And first he didn't believe that smoking was bad for you, and went around saying that publicly, and then he switched to saying there's no such thing as global warming. And actually was one of the organizers of the infamous Oregon document. But anyway, we have to be careful about how we decide what is relevant to the idea of truth. We have to be careful about who is the person who really has the authority to speak as an expert. Do you have a solution for that?
We know it's a very important point, and I agree. I never talked with Fred Seitz about his view of climate change. I corresponded with him at one point about other things, but he was much older than I am, even though I'm really old. But so that age gap was too much. I never had a chance to talk with him about that. I did read some of the things that he wrote, which were much more moderated than what the general public saw. And I think, but your point is not just specifically about Fred Seitz. It's the issue of experts, people recognized as scientists. Right, no, that's right. And another example is Steve Koonin. Steve Koonin was one of the most brilliant theoretical nuclear physicists. I don't know if Steve agrees, but in his time, in his early days, was then ultimately provost of Caltech, and then at one point chief scientist for British Petroleum, Undersecretary of Energy in the Obama administration. And then he wrote the Wall Street Journal articles that are repeating all of this nonsense about that people like Senator Inhofe would say about climate change. I don't know why people do some of these kind of things, but it's a real problem. And back to Lebron's talk, Lebron's distinction between science and law is that we're all looking for truth. You know, we're all trying to sort out what's wrong and what's really wrong and so forth. But in law, they've got a structure, they have a process, they have authority. In science, we don't have it. We've got stand-ins. So in the National Academy of Sciences, they're very careful what they do politically, right? So they're more out there right now than they usually are because of all that's going on. But we don't really have an authority. We have proxies, we have peer review, we have national academies, we have the Royal Society. So in the world, we have people that organizations that are respected. But free speech can't stop a scientist, even a very distinguished one, from getting out and saying really stupid things. Thank you for your comment. Sarah back there. Sarah,
Well,
I don't know if you have time.
we've pretty much run out of time, unfortunately, but I'd like to thank Neal again for his presentation, and I would invite all of you to join us for a short reception out front. So thank you very much, Neal.
Thank you very much.